Hey everyone. Last time we finished up our plant diversity and evolution section, and today I want to move into the second section of the course, and that is the plant form and function section. This is covered in chapter 34, I believe. Chapter 34 of Freeman. If that's the 6th or 7th edition, and then I think it's chapter 37 in the 5th edition of the course. And the chapter is named the same, plant form and function, and so it should be relatively straightforward to follow along there. Our main goals for this is really, for this section, is to address three sort of fundamental questions with respect to plant form and function. The first of those questions is, how is the plant body organized? And in this, we're going to talk about different tissue systems, as well as different tissue types throughout the plant. So we get at the organization of that plant body. And with that foundation, we can think about throughout these sections is, why are plants so diverse in their size and shape? I'll show you a few, of course, examples of that, but even just on this slide here, we can see the large baobab trees in this picture on the left, and the big giant sequoias in the picture in the middle, and then our Hawaiian silver swords, and their extreme diversity ranging from trees to small little cushion plants. And so why are plants so diverse in this size and shape? And then the third question is one about how plants grow. And so how do plants grow throughout their lives? So these are our three questions that we're going to try and focus on throughout this section. And so I'll start by showing you a close-up of this baobab picture. This is just a fantastic picture that illustrates a big point that I like to make. And so, unlike animals that can move around to find the resources that they need, plants are sedentary. Plants are stuck in place. They stay in one place, and they extend their roots and their shoots, their below ground and above ground portions, to harvest incredibly diffuse resources that are in their environment to make their own food and cope with all the stresses of that immediate environment. And so these baobab trees in Africa, this shows a great example of really diffuse resources. We can see that water is scarce in this environment, and those mineral nutrients that plants need as well are diffuse throughout the soil. Light is abundant energy source, and so using these these different systems in the plant, the above ground systems and below ground systems, they're extending these shoots and roots to harvest these incredibly diffuse resources and create, seemingly from nothing, this immense body size. So this is a pretty incredible feat, to be able to have so much biomass harvested from such resources that are so diffuse in the environment. And so, in essence, the plant's body then is really set up to harvest those diffuse resources and concentrate them into tissues and cells and tissues in the plant. And at the same time, some things that make this possible is that in a plant, the structure of its body is dynamic. And the reason that's dynamic is because plants exhibit what's called indeterminate growth. Indeterminate growth. And what do I mean by indeterminate growth? That means that plants grow throughout their lives. So unlike animal systems where most animal systems grow to a certain point and then stop growing at maturity, well, some of us grow in other dimensions, but in essence, my growth is done. Plants grow throughout their lives. And so what this is an image of, this is actually Pinus longeva. This is the oldest living organism on Earth, is this species. These grow in the mountains of Nevada and Utah, and can live up to and over 5,000 years old. And so while these plants might look like they're mostly dead, well, lots of their tissue parts are dead, we can actually see that there are living strips along this. And so here we see this individual, which might be several thousand years old, that actually has, continues to grow throughout its lifespan. So plants exhibit indeterminate growth as opposed to determinate growth. And so these are growing throughout their lives, even and upwards of thousands of years with respect to some species. So this allows for the structure of the plant body to be quite dynamic, and to sort of adjust and adapt to the situation, the immediate situation in that plant's existence or in that organism's lifetime. This is a special thing about plants. And so what plants are able to do then is they're able to take these diffuse resources. And so what are the diffuse resources that plants need? Well, plants need light. They need carbon dioxide. They need several mineral resources like nitrogen, or phosphorus, or magnesium, and potassium, some of those essential nutrients that plants need, and they need these to undergo the process of photosynthesis to generate macromolecules. And what I mean by macromolecules is, molecules are the sugars that are the result of photosynthesis that allow them to continue to grow and maintain their structure throughout their lives. So these are these diffuse resources that are out there in their environment: light, mineral nutrients, carbon dioxide, and this allows them to photosynthesize and create those macromolecules. And so let's take a look and see how is the plant body actually organized to allow this to happen. And so the plant body is organized mainly into two tissue systems that we're going to talk about: the root system, or two systems, I should say, that we'll talk about. I'll talk specifically about some of the tissues types and tissue systems that run throughout the plant in just a minute. The first of those is the root system. And so the root system is underground for the most part. And its major role is in nutrient uptake and water uptake, nutrient and water uptake from the soil. And so the root system acquires water and dissolves nutrients from the soil. That's a simple function of that root system. The above ground part of the plant is the shoot system. So that shoot system is above ground. And what's the primary function of the shoot system? Well, that's to acquire carbon dioxide and light from the atmosphere. acquire CO2 and light energy from the atmosphere. That's the main function of the chute system. Now within this, we've got multiple different systems. We've got the root system, the chute system, and then a really important part of the chute system and the above ground system is the leaf system. And so the leaf system itself is really a very efficient light harvester. Leaves are out there expressly to acquire light. Okay, within each of these systems, the root system, the shoot system, and the leaf system, we've got three tissue types that are made up. I'm going to that make up these different systems in the plant, and those three systems are actually shown in colors on this figure here. And so in light blue, around the outside of the plant, is the dermal tissue system. And the dermal tissue has a very specific role. And it's the same as the dermal tissue system in our bodies and in animal systems. And so you can think about what's the main role for that dermal tissue system. Well, that is protecting the plant body, right? So protection is our big role for dermal tissue. We're protecting the plant body, and that's protecting from pathogens, protecting from herbivores, protecting from the environment itself, from sort of abiotic pressures from the environment. So both protection from biotic things as well as abiotic things. And so that's shown in light blue all throughout this figure here. We see on the outside this dermal tissue system. The second part, the second tissue type that we find in plants is the yellow type that's thrown throughout here. And this makes up the bulk of the plant body. This is called the ground tissue. And so ground tissue also has some specific functions. One of them is for structure and support. So to actually structurally support the plant body itself. Another important part of the ground tissue is actually starch storage. So storing the products of photosynthesis or energy. And then the third one is actually photosynthesis itself. And so the ground tissue is actually where the photosynthetic machinery is and where photosynthesis occurs. Okay, the third tissue type, and so that's all the yellow throughout the plant. And so we've got ground tissue in the leaves, we have ground tissue in the above ground shoots, and of course we have ground tissue in the below ground roots. All for structural support, storing starches, and for performing photosynthesis in the above ground parts of the plant. All right, the third part is the purple. The third tissue type that we have is the purple throughout here. And you'll notice that the purple actually is responsible for connecting the above ground shoot system and the below ground root system. And this is actually the vascular tissue. So we've already talked a little bit about vascular tissue. And so I think we understand what the main roles of vascular tissue are. And so the vascular tissue, you remember, is responsible for water and sugar transport throughout the plant. So for moving that water from the soil out to the photosynthesizing parts of the plant, and then taking that photosynthate, those sugars, and moving them to the storage parts of the plants or to the growing parts of the plant. Another really important part of vascular system. You can think about wood. We described, wood as secondary xylem. Xylem is that tissue, that specific cell type within the vascular tissue. We described that role, secondary xylem as wood, right? And so wood, we know, also has an incredible structural support or structural role in the plant. So we've got structure and support in the vascular tissue the vascular tissue type as well. Okay, so what we're going to do throughout here is actually go through each of these main systems, the root system, the shoot system, and the leaf system, and talk about the different tissue types that are found in each of these systems and their roles. And before we do that, I want to just take a minute to actually look at a little bit more about how the plant body is organized and how and label some of the parts of the plant, just so that when we're talking about these, we actually are on the same page with respect to how each part of the plant is organized. And so I'll just quick reminder, we've got the root system below ground, we've got the shoot system above ground, and then we've got our leaf system as part of that above ground bit. I'll start with the roots just and work our way up. So we've already defined the root system's main role is for water and nutrient absorption. And a lot of times this is broken up, root systems are broken up into the tap root and some lateral roots. So as we label these parts, this isn't always the case. Sometimes we'll look at a few different types of roots. We have fibrous root systems or swollen root systems that are for storage, but in general, the root system oftentimes has this tap root and lateral roots as it's trying to harvest that water and nutrients from the soil. The shoot system and that above ground part is, remember, responsible for sunlight and carbon dioxide absorption. And we can also look at the different, we can label the parts that are on here as well. So out at the tip, we have an apical bud. And so if you think back to our last lecture, inside of that apical bud is where that apical meristem is. So this is where primary growth occurs in the plant. Primary growth is coming from those apical buds, the apical meristem inside there, where cell division is happening inside that cell. And so we've got our apical bud. There's a couple of them on here. So remember that the branches also have apical buds associated with them as well. We have in the axils of these leaves, or where at the point where the leaf attaches to the stem, we also see our axillary buds. And so remember, these are responsible for creating our branches, or our lateral branches. And so here we have a lateral or axillary branch. When we talk about different parts of the plant, we often will talk about the nodes. And so the point of attachment of a leaf or other parts of the plant is called a node. And so here's one node, here's another node, here's a third node. And then the distance between those, the region between the nodes, is called an internode. And then, of course, the main, above ground axis we refer to as the stem. I believe that's most of what I want to label on here. And so when we think about that plant, what we see is, growth is occurring in that above ground and below ground section from the apical buds, from the apical meristems that are happening there. And then we have this sort of repeating series of nodes and internodes that make up the plant body. So yeah, just wanted to get some of those terms out there so that when we're talking about these, we can use this terminology to move through the material. And then just to end this out here, so although we can't see this on here, the vascular tissue is responsible for connecting that above ground and below ground. So connecting the root and shoot systems together. So that's an important role of the vascular system. When we look at plant parts, it's really clear that the morphology of especially roots and leaves, since remember the main role here for roots and leaves is to harvest those diffuse resources. The morphology of roots and leaves actually give them a very high surface area to volume ratio. And that surface area to volume ratio is really important in making them efficient harvesters for these. And so I just want to show you a little bit of an example here of how the same number of cells in each of these examples that we see on here, we have 64 cells in a thick structure, a tube-like structure, and a flattened structure. And we can see at the bottom here what the surface area to volume ratio is for these different morphologies for the same number of cells. And so plants can vary their morphologies dependent on the function of that particular tissue. And so if we think of a thick structure like this one with its surface area to volume ratio, we can think about what's the main role of something like this. This is a potato. For those that don't know, a potato is an underground stem, and it's modified for starch storage. And so as such, its morphology has that surface area to volume ratio that are relatively equal in terms of that, in terms of the dimensions of these cells. Whereas in a root, where we actually are trying to get out there and absorb, we want to increase that surface area to volume ratio. And so these tube-like structures have morphologies that are adapted for absorption of water and nutrients, as well as transport of those absorbed materials throughout the plant. And so the surface area to volume ratio is higher than in a storage organ. And then where we see the highest surface area to volume ratio is actually in these flattened out leaf-like structures. Those flattened leaf structure here shows the highest surface area to volume ratio. And we know that the main role for leaves is absorption of light energy. And so the most efficient way to do that is having this flat structure with this high surface area to volume ratio. Okay, what I'd like to do now is move through a couple of these systems, and starting with the root system. And so the root system, this is one of my favorite posters of root systems in prairie plants. This shows really nicely how the above ground and below ground biomasses differ between different species, and how the morphologies, how morphology of roots and shoots are sort of trying to balance the competition with their neighbors. And we'll go through this a little bit more. But I love this image, and so I put this up there mainly to show you that in the plant, the root systems can make up more than 80% of a plant's biomass. So this is like that tip of the iceberg sort of analogy where you see the tip of the iceberg above the water level, but below the water level, we've actually got a lot more biomass. Same thing going on in most plants. We've got the below ground portion making up about 80% of the plant's total biomass. This is a lot. And so a lot going on below ground. So what's the main functions of this root system? Well, we can list a few of them. We've already talked about water and nutrient uptake. Another is storage of energy. And so specifically storing photosynthate as starches to be used later in the growing season when that's needed. Another important function of the root system is actually to anchor the plant to the substrate. So to keep those plants kind of anchored to their spot, whether that substrate be the soil or whether that be a plant growing on top of another plant, an epiphyte growing on the branch of another plant, the roots are often there to anchor them to the substrate. And I'll show you some examples of some of these types of anchor roots. Roots are also very important in vegetative reproduction. The one thing that's interesting about plant cells is the plant cells are totipotent. And what totipotent means is that each cell contains the genetic material and machinery to be any type of cell throughout the plant. And so each cell you can regenerate an entire plant from any cell in the plant. So this is like stem cells in animal systems. Stem cells are a very unique type of cell. Well, in plants, all cells are totipotent and able to actually be part of reproduction. And so one really easy way to vegetatively propagate plants is breaking off the roots and starting out new plants from those roots. Another really important role for the root system is actually oxygen absorption. So we talk a lot about carbon dioxide because of its role in photosynthesis, and plants absorb carbon dioxide and they give off oxygen through that photosynthetic process. Well, plant cells also have to respirate. And so plant cells also need oxygen. And so most of that oxygen is absorbed through, or much of that oxygen is absorbed through the root system. And so oxygen absorption is actually a big role of the roots themselves. Okay, so that's some of our the main functions of the root system. Let's look a bit at the diversity that we see in the root system. And I'm going to stick with this analogy of, or not analogy, this example of the root system that we see in prairie plants. And so here's a figure from your textbook that's a little bit simplified version of what I just showed you. And what this shows is that in some plants, we can have very short fibrous root system, like in these grasses. But even within those grasses, we actually have some that have shorter root system and some that might have a little bit longer, more extensive or deeper root system. We also have other plants that have these long tap roots associated with them. And so here's an example of a taproot root system in there. And so what we see is that the root system diversity that we see in this example of these prairie plants actually is enabling many different species to live together without directly competing for the same resources. And so this diversity actually reduces competition for those limited resources in the soil. By distributing where those resources are actually being harvested from based on, in this example, the depth of those roots or the extensiveness of the root system. And you know, most of these plants, while they die back every summer. So these are herbaceous plants, where the above ground part of the plant will die back in the summertime. The below ground part of the plant is maintained and can then a new plant is regenerated from those from that root system every year. And so this has actually been shown in some really great experiments, community ecology experiments by a group, Tillman et al. At the University of Minnesota. And what they showed is that if we look at a plot of diversity, and that diversity can be measured in a number of ways. You could think of this diversity as number of species, so total number of species, or morphological diversity. And those two oftentimes will go hand in hand, right? We have a lot of different species, we have a lot of different morphologies, but as diversity increases on the x-axis here, on the y-axis we can look at productivity in the system, and productivity is typically measured by biomass. And so what we see is that there's a pretty clear linear relationship that as diversity increases, productivity increases. And so this is a direct result of this example that I've shown you here, is that by reducing the competition for those limited resources, we're actually able to exploit the limited resources more fully in that environment. And so as that diversity, morphological diversity increases, we can increase the productivity of the system. And that's a very clear relationship in community ecology, that as diversity increases, productivity will also increase. All right, in root systems, we also see some plasticity in those systems. And so we'll kind of go through in each of the systems, the shoot, the leaf, and the root. We'll talk about this in the same way. We'll talk about some of the diversity that we see, and I'll talk about the plasticity that we see. And then we'll also talk about modifications to the sort of standard, just so that we have this sort of clear thing within this sort of clear progression within each of these systems. And so when we look at the plasticity in the root system, well, first of all, what do I mean by plasticity? And what I mean by plasticity is changes in the morphology due to the environment. Changes in morphology due to environmental variation. And so implied in that is that these changes are not genetic. So these are genetically identical individuals that when you put them in different environments, end up with a different phenotype or a different morphology. And so that's what we call phenotypic plasticity. And so here's an example just from corn in root system and plasticity. And so the idea is that corn is going to, remember, corn is trying to, plants are trying to, with their root system, find those diffuse resources. And so in general, roots will grow into areas of the soil where resources are abundant, and roots won't grow any further than they need to, and they will either not grow or die back where those resources are not available. And so in this experiment, we had, they set up a couple of, and it basically showing the same thing on both of these slides, a couple of situations where we have genetically identical individuals that are grown in low nitrogen and high nitrogen environments. And what we see, sorry, I've got that flip-flopped. Let me switch those around. where these are grown in high nitrogen, so a fertilized environment, and low nitrogen environment. And as I was just saying, roots are going to grow into areas where those resources are abundant, and those are going to die back and not grow in areas where those resources are used or are lacking. And so in that high nitrogen environment, what do we see is we see lots of root growth that are going out there and harvesting that resource out of the environment, where in the low nitrogen environment, we see this actually not, you know, the roots not growing as much because they're not finding those resources that they need. And we see the same thing in this panel E, a little bit less growth. This is a different root of the root system. It doesn't matter. In the high nitrogen, we see them growing into those regions where the nitrogen is available, and low nitrogen, they're not growing. And so genetically identical individuals, a different environment, high nitrogen and low nitrogen, and we get a different response from those plants. Okay, so morphologies can be plastic depending on the environmental conditions. Let's take a look at a couple different types of modified roots that we have, and what those might be used for. And so here on the right is a picture of ivy. This is English ivy, like growing out on the admin building. Ivy and ivy produces something that are called anchor roots, and these anchor roots are these roots that are actually attaching the plant attaching the stem to the substrate. And so here we're anchoring to the substrate. In this case, this would be the brick of the building. And so here's above ground roots that are actually anchoring these to the substrate. So this is a structural support. And then we have the same thing happening, structural support in prop roots that we find in corn. So this is a corn plant, and these are individual prop roots that are actually just like the name implies, these are structural support as well. And in both of these cases, these are both cases where root tissue is actually arising from the stem tissue itself. So we have the stem in the ivy, and we have the root tissue arising off of it. We have the stem in the corn, and we have these prop roots arising off of that. These are, in both cases, these are adventitious roots. And all that refers to is roots that arise from stem tissue. Are referred to as adventitious roots. And so these are both providing different types of support in the plant. Another cool modification is the modification of what we call pneumatophores. And so pneumatophores are actually for gas exchange. So remember, we talked about oxygen absorption as being one of the main, as one of the functions of roots. Well, in aquatic or semi-aquatic environments, like we see in this bald cypress swamp down here, these grow in along the Mississippi River and in the southeastern U.S. In the bayous. This is bald cypress. And then these are mangroves. And so mangroves are very common throughout the coastal regions of the world. And in both of these, we see these roots arising, or these structures, these pneumatophores arising from the root system below and pushing up above the water. And we're seeing them in these pictures here on the right as well. These are called pneumatophores, and they are for oxygen absorption. And so these pneumatophores actually allow the plant to breathe. without these, it's important to recognize that these plants actually would drown. And so if you overwater a plant, or a plant that's not a plant that has this adaptation, like an oak tree or something, if you put that oak tree in standing water for too long, it will drown. So the oxygen, the cells won't get oxygen and they'll die. And so plants also need to breathe, and pneumatophores are one way that this occurs in these aquatic or semi-aquatic environments. There's another important function of pneumatophores besides oxygen absorption, and that's also support in loose soils. So there is a structural support that's happening in the loose, muddy soils that are associated with these sort of semi-aquatic or where water levels fluctuate environments. And so there is some support there. We've got all these pneumatophores sticking up, sort of holding the plant into that substrate. But some people didn't know that plants actually, those plant roots are actually breathing as well, and these pneumatophores allow them to do that. Another important modification to the root system is something called Historia, or a Historium, and this is important for parasitic plants. So actually a whole part of my research program is studying the evolution of a group of parasitic plants called the Orobanchaceae, and there's a couple of examples of them here, but there are multiple, about 20 different groups of plants that have evolved parasitism, where they will actually make a connection, typically root-to-root connections or root-to-stem connections, with a host plant and steal water and nutrients and photosynthate from them. And so here is an example of a plant called Orobanchaceae. This is the parasite. So this is a parasitic plant that is parasitizing a host plant. And so here's our host plant. And it does that through making root-to-root connections to that host plant. And it does those root-to-root connections through an organ called a Historium. Whoops. Oh, that was right, Historium. That Historium is a special organ that's made for actually penetrating the root system, connecting the vascular tissue of the parasitic plant by penetrating the vascular tissue of the host plant. And in doing so, it actually steals water and nutrients as well as photosynthate from the plant. So Historium is the organ, it's a specialized organ for parasitizing other plant vascular tissues. Parasitizing vascular tissue of a host plant. So a cool modification that we see throughout plants. It's evolved multiple different times, parasitizing other plants. But in all of those, we have this specialized organ, this modification of the root system, this specialized Historium, to be able to actually make that parasitic connection. Okay. I'm going to end there, and we will pick up next time with the shoot system and working through the same type of progression, looking at diversity of shoots as well as their different modifications and plasticity associated with the shoot system. Okay, thank you.